Awesome. All right, let's get started. If I may, I'd like to introduce Kevin Shekleton. Kevin is a polyglot technologist and a bit of a jerk for making me say the word polyglot. He's worked in a wide variety of systems throughout his career in the healthcare IT industry, passionate about technology and interoperability and open source. Kevin is the lead of the CDS Hooks project and has helped build a vibrant community of support around the project. At Cerner, he's currently responsible for multiple aspects of Cerner's platforms and solutions, support of Smart on FHIR, support for CDS Hooks, mobile architectures, and software cybersecurity strategy and implementation. So thank you very much, Kevin. Take it away.
Thank you. If I knew that someone was going to read the bio that I had to submit for the conference, I would have written it in a much different way to be much more embarrassing, but thank you. Hello everyone, my name is Kevin. I'm here to talk about what Cerner has been doing with Smart on FHIR, how we kind of have our experiences over the past several years with that and some of the lessons that we've learned. I don't have to do the little about me that I usually do since I had someone here reading my bio, but this is my usual about me. For today, all you need to know is that I work on Smart on FHIR at Cerner, and I'm responsible for our implementation there. I'm guessing everyone knows a bit about Cerner, but this is like the corporate about Cerner slide that I've injected into this presentation. But basically, we're a really big healthcare IT company. One of the things we do is EHR software, but we do a lot of other things. We are, I know, deployed here in the Canadian market. At Cerner, being an open platform is very, very important to us, and it's a core part of how we think about our solutions. And this comes from our late founder and CEO, Neil Patterson, who he was before a committee at the US government, and he said the health IT platforms must be open. The quality of being open is what allows independent developers to build apps and extensions that work with existing health IT platforms. So, to this, we have been early adopters to Smart on FHIR, to FHIR, and now early adopters here coming up here with CDS Hooks. So this is something that we talk a lot about internally. We also, the phrase, eating your own dog food, or I heard a better version of that, which is we drink our own champagne. But basically, we have internal teams consuming our FHIR APIs. We have internal teams building Smart on FHIR applications that run inside of our EHR. So it's very core to what we do and believe. Our Smart on FHIR support and FHIR support within our Millennium, which is our core EMR platform, is branded Ignite. So if I say Ignite APIs, or you see that on a slide, what that means is it's the name that we've given our support for Smart on FHIR within our EHR. We took a very interesting approach when we started to develop our Smart on FHIR support way back in 2015, or 2014 is actually when we started. So what we did was, well, let me back up. All of our clients, so we're a very mature company. We've been around now for 38, almost 39 years. Our EHR software has been around for a very long time, since the mid-90s. And so the platform that it exists is a very traditional one that you would find, if you wrote something back in the mid-90s, where you have a client-server architecture. And of course, it's evolved since then. But at its core, every hospital, every health system has their own install of the Cerner EHR of Millennium. So they have their own database, their own application or mid-tier, their own application tier, like it's their own setup. And there are some clients that do share, so it's a multi-tenant system. But even so, that multi-tenant system is co-located or physically located with the client is, or Cerner hosts it. And so what that means is that we've got all these different databases, all these different sources of truths across all of our clients. And we knew that if we just built our Smart on FHIR support directly on top of that would not provide a good developer experience. And I'll get into more details of that in a bit. But what we did was we basically created a cloud API, or an API deployed in the cloud for FHIR. So Cerner runs a consistent single API for our FHIR implementation that can reach in and call back into each one of the specific databases of the healthcare institutions. But having that consistent cloud-based APIs means that developers have a single URL where the FHIR server exists at. And it's a consistent version because we manage all the differences in the versions amongst the different clients and hide that from the developer. And so that means that when a Cerner customer takes our Ignite APIs, that's the DSTU2 version of FHIR, every single customer that takes that is on that same version. And when we support a new version of FHIR, so say DSTU or STU3, then all the customers automatically get upgraded. They don't have to take any new code or new package or anything like that. And so that allows mobile smart applications, desktop applications, patient or provider-facing apps, all to be consuming and calling that same cloud endpoint, which technically was an interesting challenge to solve, but it's one that's really important. So the other benefit of this too is that not only do we have now a consistent single endpoint for developers, and we hide all of that, the differences in versioning, so all the resources that we implement are implemented consistently across every single provider that or client that has this support. When we go and add a new FHIR resource, which we are always developing new FHIR resources, and we turn it on, then that gets turned on for all clients. It's not like, oh, only this client has it, but this other client doesn't. So it's a very, very conscious decision we made for developers because we knew without this that would be pretty unmanageable over time. As part of this, all of our Ignite APIs and all the Smart and FHIR support is wrapped around this program called Code, or Cerner Open Developer Experience. And that's available at code.cerner.com. And you hear people talk a lot about like app stores for healthcare and stuff like that. And I actually don't think that there's actually going to be an app store. And no vendor today has an app store for smart apps. What we have, and other EHR vendors have something very similar. So we have what's called an app gallery. So the developer program here, when you get into it, basically allows Cerner to validate the application and provide trust to our clients that the applications that they're taking have been validated from various perspectives, which I'll get into. And then we list the applications that have gone through that program on the app gallery here on Code. So the way that looks is that developers can freely go to Code and start playing with our sandbox, explore whatever ideas they want. We've got a completely open sandbox that they can mess around in. You can do both read and writes. And once they have kind of got their idea fleshed out and they have a client that, a partner client that's identified, their business folks and our business folks talk and they work out the business stuff that I'm not involved in because I'm on the engineering side, and get into the code program that goes through the validation process, which I'll get into, and ultimately they get listed in that app gallery. Hospitals can then choose from any of those apps. They can also write their own apps, and they don't have to go through this program at all, and include those within their workflow. Now, all of that's for provider-facing apps. For patient-facing apps, it actually looks different. Patient-facing apps don't go through this process because the patient gets to decide what applications they want to connect to their own data. But for hospitals, they're deciding for their staff which applications they feel are appropriate to use within their workflow. So again, as a developer, you'd start off playing around with the open endpoint, and this is actually no different than most of the other EHR vendors that I'm aware of. We have something called a code console, which is basically like a developer console to play around to register your application, tell us whether or not it's a patient-facing app or provider-facing app, what scopes you need for OAuth 2 if you're in Dr. Hayes' talk earlier about Smart. He briefly touched on scopes with Smart. And then you're testing out in that sandbox environment. When you're ready and you have a client, you would test out in their non-prod environment. All clients that I've seen always want to test things out in their non-prod with a set of test users and test patients, and then once they're comfortable, then they'll move your application into production. That app validation process that I went through is actually the most significant part of the whole code program. And it goes through, there's 4 main pieces that we go through with every single application. The first is a security review. So we go through a comprehensive security review of the app. So that's a fairly involved process with our security team where we have a dialogue with the app developer and ask them a series of questions about the application, about their deployment model. We have them do a threat model of the application. We run a various set of security scans against the application, looking for known vulnerabilities or security misconfigurations. Once the app goes through that security review, then it goes through a UX review. This is where we have a Cerner UX designer go through the application and look at it embedded within our EHR power chart. And the UX designer looks to ensure that the application is not displaying anything that is in conflict with how the design idioms of PowerChart are. So for instance, in PowerChart, for a required field, the field goes yellow, like the text box is yellow. It means, hey, you need to enter in something here, it's required. So if a smart application has a required field and they're using, say, red or something as the color, but for us, red means there's some sort of error, then we'll alert the developer that, hey, this doesn't follow the style guidelines that we have, and so what will happen is the users of the app will be confused and be upset. We actually publish our design guidelines for the developer, so once you're in the program, you get access to all of that, so you know how to make how your app should behave within when running within a Cerner system. This is actually, as an aside, one of the gaps in the SMART specification, and one of the things that is actually really difficult to solve, in that SMART is all about making an open and interoperable application that can go from any vendor to any vendor. But because the SMART application is a UI application, it's going to look different, when it gets plugged into different EHR vendors. Like, it's going to feel different. If you think about, SMART, a lot of people use the analogy of like mobile phones, and so there's really only 2 platforms now, is iOS and Android. Both of those have style guidelines, and if you write an app for Apple or write an app for Android, you're going to follow the style guidelines. SMART doesn't have that. There's an attempt to add that into the specification, but it's really, really difficult to do because there's just so much that you can do with an application. It's hard to codify in a standard way, a standard around UX. So again, our UX is the other major part of the app validation. The other piece is a functional review, which it's not that we review the functionality of your app to say, like, is this useful? It's not that at all. It's really more, when you're interacting with the FHIR APIs, are you doing it in a functionally correct way? There are many, many applications that do not understand that FHIR has paging. So they go and try to get all the labs for a patient, and they call our observation API in FHIR, and we return back the first 20 results, and then we return a link to the next page, and we never see the application make a call to the next page. We always see it just making a call to the first page and never to the next page. And so oftentimes that happens quite a bit, and we alert the developer, hey, do you have a bug in here, because we don't see any calls being made to the next page, and then usually it's like, yes, they realize that. Or they're calling us and they don't put filters. We notice in their app that it only displays, say, active meds, but when they call our FHIR API, they're asking for all statuses for all meds, and they're getting back a lot more data. And so we say, hey, are you really wanting just the active meds? Because if so, here's the filter that you could put on that query to make it a lot more efficient. And then the final part of the review is the operational and technical part. And so this is stuff like, well, when there's an issue with your application, who gets contacted? Hospitals will go through their regular support tier, at least in Cerner's case, for any issues. But if the issue can't be resolved along the lower tiers, once it reaches the higher tiers, who do we contact on your side? What's the agreement on support, what happens if it's after hours, and stuff like that. So there's quite a bit in the app validation. And again, this is just for provider-facing applications. So we've got a bunch of different partners in our code program. These are the latest companies that have applications inside of the developer program. The biggest thing to get into the program, because I get asked this a lot, like how do I get in the program? Basically, if you have a Cerner client that wants to use your application, you'll get into the program. We have lots and lots of companies contact us that want to get in, and we ask them, okay, great, what's your application, and who's the client? And oftentimes they haven't built the application yet, or they don't have a Cerner client. And that's not something that we have the bandwidth to help everybody with, to say, oh, we'll go and introduce you to all these clients. That's on the app developer. It's their responsibility to do that. Once an app developer has an application, they've tested it in our sandbox, it's totally free, and they have a client, then we can go start doing the app validation process. That app gallery that I mentioned, which is not a store by any means, it's just a listing on our code program website, the code.cerner.com, that just lists all the apps that have gone through that validation process. There's no installing an application. I don't think there will ever be an app store for smart apps, at least not for provider-facing ones, because oftentimes there's nothing to install. These are web applications. Also, the pricing for these apps, doesn't go through Cerner. It's the healthcare system and the app developer. On your phone, you've got a very simple pricing model with Apple or Android, where they, have tiers and they have set prices. But with all of these applications, I mean, they charge by bed, they charge by a flat rate or by user. There's all sorts of different pricing models, and so that's not something that's ever going to get standardized by anybody. With Cerner, we have various integrations with smart apps, so you can run a smart app in an organization view, which basically means you're looking at multiple patients. So you can have an app that looks at data from multiple patients. You can have an app inside of just a single patient's chart. We have a thing called M-Pages, which is also within a patient's chart, but it's like more of like a component than a full view. We have our patient portal that's for patient-facing apps, and then you can run standalone web applications or native applications. If you are using the 4 and above, so that's the Power Chart ones or the Healthy Life one, you get single sign-on functionality because you're embedded within one of our applications. If you're outside of the one of our applications and it's standalone, then the user's going to get prompted with a sign-in to authenticate to the app. Last night I pulled some interesting metrics that I thought you guys would like to see. So we've been in production now for, this is our 3rd year in production with Smart on FHIR apps, and obviously we started really small. As of today, we have 31 apps in production. And this is the past 30 days. There was a little over 12,000 unique users. So this is 12,000 unique users at all of our clients that have our Smart on FHIR support that launched. Of those 31 apps, there was nearly 95,000 app launches. And those apps made 1.2 million FHIR calls. So I've got more detailed data that I don't have here, but it's pretty interesting to look at like the distribution, because we have apps that are certainly much more heavier users of the FHIR APIs than other apps. And we also have certain clients who have really worked to embed smart applications into their workflow, and we have other clients that just have them available, but it's not necessarily part of the workflow that the users would go to every day. So we have wide spectrum of usage of Smart on FHIR, but it continues to grow. And in the US, we have this thing called meaningful use, which I'm sure probably everyone's aware of or at least heard of. And for the latest stage of meaningful use, there was a requirement to provide just an API to the healthcare data. It didn't say it had to be FHIR. It didn't have to even be a standard. and API. And at Cerner, we decided to meet that with our support with FHIR. Uptick is what we were expecting. We were expecting all of our clients in the US to have it as of last year, but with the delay, it caused some clients to kind of pause some of that stuff, but we're constantly doing implementations of getting our Smart on FHIR support at clients. We have an very active developers as of last night are on that group, which is pretty cool. As you heard in the introduction, I love open source. Cerner loves open source as well. You can go to github.com/Cerner and look at all of our open source repositories. We're up to in the 60s now. Everything that we release is Apache licensed, which means that you can do whatever you want with it, including you could take any of our open source code and you could resell it. The license lets you do that. Specific to Smart on FHIR, we worked with cardiologists at Duke to develop this AASCVD risk calculator smart app. It is a open source responsive web application that runs the AASCVD cardiac risk score and calculates that. And this is so patients or providers could use this application. The interesting thing that I'll note here is that Duke is not a Cerner client. They are a client of one of our major competitors. But we saw a need in both our clients as well as I knew some physicians at Duke. And so we decided, why not work on this together and collaborate on this and release it as open source. So that was a pretty fun project to work on. And you can go and grab that from our GitHub repository and run it at your site if you want. Or just look at the code to see how it was built. We have some other open source projects. These are specific to, again, if you're building smart apps. So if you are running a smart app inside of Cerner, there is a JavaScript library you need to include in your application so that it runs properly within Cerner's web framework for PowerChart. And then if you're writing a smart application for any EHR vendor that has an embedded web application in a C++ application, which is Cerner and Epic and Allscripts, I know those two for sure, then you need that second library. Otherwise, you will have a patient safety bug in your application. So we found that early on while developing our Smart on FHIR support inside of PowerChart, Cerner's library, realized that it probably applied to anyone who had an application similar to our EHR. We reached out to those vendors, had them confirm that, yeah, it was the same scenario, and so we fixed it and released that open source library for anyone to use. You can go to FHIR.cerner.com, I mentioned this earlier, to view our developer documentation. So all of our documentation, this is like a living document of our FHIR server, all the resources that we support, all the operations we support, examples in there. As we add support for new resources, it gets added to here. This documentation is production. So if you see it on this page, that means it's running at Cerner client sites. And for those that are sneaky and really up on these things, all this documentation is in GitHub, so it's also open source, and so you can actually, we publicly say that we don't tell people what we're working on. We don't give dates because we don't want to set wrong expectations, but you can see what we're working on when we're reviewing documentation updates a few weeks out, because we'll be reviewing those. And so if you're watching our repository, you can see what new resources are going to pop up in the next couple of weeks. Here's a list of current FHIR resources that we support in production today. You can see that we support not just read operations, but also write and updates. And there's slides. I think the slides will be available to everyone if you want. I'm going to skip over in the interest of time some of the slides. We have a Smart on FHIR tutorial that is open source that anyone can use for developers to write their first Smart on FHIR application. The tutorial has you go through hooking it up to the Cerner sandbox as well as the Smart Health IT sandbox. You can also take your Smart app and hook it up to any other vendor sandboxes to demonstrate that your application is interoperable and works against any of the other vendors, which is pretty cool. Okay, now I want to quick talk about a problem kind of lesson learned here with around fragmentation. And so this was talked about in the excellent session this morning on the FHIR for executives, but I'll just briefly touch upon it again, is that fragmentation is going to be a problem at some point in probably the next year or two. So in the US, most of the major vendors support DSTU2 version of FHIR in production, which is the version that the Argonaut project kind of landed upon when that kind of rallied all the EHR developers to support FHIR in a consistent and standard way. As the vendors start to move to like STU3 or R4 when that gets finalized, you're now going to see fragmentation of the market where some hospitals are going to be on DSTU2, some will be on STU3, some will be on R4, and it's going to be a challenge for developers. This is something that I don't have a solution for. It'll be interesting to see how this works out. This morning we talked about low resource countries that may not have the resources or bandwidth to go and keep up to date on all the FHIR versions. I would say that we also have low resource developers in the US specifically, and in probably every other country, because most of these developers writing the smart apps that I've seen are very small companies. So they might have just maybe no more than 3 or 4 developers. And so they don't have the bandwidth or resources to constantly be updating their application to keep up with all the different versions of FHIR. So this will be interesting to see. Since I'm here in Canada, I'll mention that we don't have yet at Cerner Smart on FHIR support with our Canadian clients, and that's due to 2 things. One, the stuff that we talked about this morning with the Canadian-specific profiles that would need to be created for the FHIR APIs. But then there's also data locality laws that we're running into. So our servers at Cerner are based in the US, and to go to any other market, in order for that data to flow through those servers, we need those servers to be located in that region. So we're working on that, and that's not an insurmountable barrier by any means, but it is an additional step for vendors like Cerner and others to, before they enter in that market, make sure that they're abiding by all the various data locality laws. With that, I'm out of time, and I thank you all for your time, and I'll take questions in the back here. Oh, we got some time? Yeah. Yeah, AWS is the one we use, and so we're moving everything to AWS. So, well, the pieces that are relevant here to AWS. And there's thankfully a AWS region here in Canada. Yes.
Okay, I'll just yell. There is a microphone here, let's pretend it works.
Okay.
Thanks for a great talk. A couple questions you may or may not know. I understand you're more from engineering than the business side, but presumably if there was a Canadian cloud for Cerner, which I know Jim Shave keeps saying is going to happen, is there any licensing cost for a given hospital to have the capability to consume Smart on FHIR apps, or is it just kind of available to all from the get-go?
So to my knowledge, we're not charging clients at all when we stand up. So we've actually already stood up an AWS region here in Canada for other solutions. So Healthy Life, our patient portal, our Pop Health platform is going here as well. I'm not aware of any additional licensing costs. I believe that we're just rolling that into our standard. This is the cost of doing business. So.
Okay, thanks. And on the developer side, are there any costs for the program, or does Cerner take a cut through the app gallery, or not?
So for patient-facing apps, the answer is there's not a cost because it's covered in the free tier for patients, using applications for themselves. So for provider-facing apps, there is a business model there, and I honestly don't know the full details of it because frankly it's changed quite a bit. Like it started off one way 2 years ago and has basically been shifting based upon the market. My last when I last was up on it, it was some sort of revenue sharing agreement between, so Cerner gets some percentage of the application that they sell to a provider. That's only for, again, for applications that are sold for, if you work at a hospital and you write your own apps, Cerner's not involved in that. It's your own stuff. But once it gets sold, then that's where there's some sort of revenue sharing. But I don't know the specifics on like the details of like how much and all that stuff.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thanks.
And this is another aside. So while I am on the engineering side, I'm very aware of the business side of things and see and recognize how important that is to really be successful with everybody. Because once the business gets in there where you've got third-party companies that can sustain themselves selling applications to hospitals or whomever, then you're going to get a bigger market of stuff. And once EHR vendors like Cerner see a direct value to the bottom line as well, then they invest more into this type of thing. Because that just helps everyone.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Just following on that question, well, this mic works. The validation step looks expensive. Who bears the cost of that?
So there is a nominal fee for the validation step for the developer, which I think is around like $5,000. However, I can tell you we spend at Cerner way more money in our time than that $5,000. And that's something that right now the number of apps is fairly small, not because of the validation, but because just the pipeline is fairly small. But as that increases, we're going to have to adjust our validation, and we already have adjusted over the past 2 years to make it more efficient and remove as many people as possible from that process.
So, yeah, I suspected that was the case. Does that mean that you do a little bit of a market validation? Even if someone comes with a client, you might be interested in, okay, how successful could this be, and when you assess whether you're going to spend that effort?
Honestly, we haven't done that type of validation because oftentimes the developers figure that out for themselves. That, hey, and actually our very first app that we worked with, the market was not there for it, and the developer ended up pulling the app because it was such a niche market that they realized that they weren't going to make any money out of it, and so they just said, we'll forget this. But if we have a client that is willing to use the application, we will absolutely take them through the validation process, because at the end of the day, we want our clients to be happy.
And just a last question, I imagine a certain version of Cerner is required for this kind of support. So in order for a hospital to be ready for that, when it does come to Canada, they'd have to be up to a certain version. Do you keep all of your sites up to version, or is it up to the client site whether they upgrade or not? And where's Canada at in terms of having sufficient Cerner versions to support this stuff?
I'm not familiar on the specific versions, but I can, if we talk offline, I can go find that out. But we actually have our Smart on FHIR support on a fairly early version, and so we don't have any problems with clients having to take it. We talked about this morning the mapping process and mapping all the standard terminologies. That's actually honestly the biggest challenge when a client wants to take our support. And I should end it there. Thank you very much again for your time.